Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to our news bulletin for tonight, read by me, Lama Sayas. President Bashar al-Assad gave an interview to the American Fox News network in which he affirmed that the Russian role politically was very efficient during the crisis in Syria, referring that during the last 2 years and a half, Russia vetoed 3 times in the Security Council, so actually they protected Syria politically. His Excellency stressed that Syria supported the Geneva process from the very beginning and cooperated with the UN envoys that came to Syria, pointing out that the one who put obstacles wasn't Syria, neither Russia nor China, it was the United States from many different reasons. One of the main reasons is that they do not have real opposition abroad. They know this is one of the main problems because the core of the Geneva Conference is to be based on the will of the Syrian people, so whatever we agree upon in Geneva will be proposed in the Syrian people, and if they do not have grassroots, you cannot convince the Syrian people to move with you. Foreign and Expatriates Ministry addressed 2 identical letters to the UN Security Council Chairman and UN Secretary General on the continuation of the US and its Western allies and regional tools to provide funds and arms to Al-Qaeda and its offshoots and the rest of the armed terrorist groups in Syria. The letters pointed out that Syria has inundated the UN Security Council and the UN Secretary General with tens of letters, including a documentation of what Syria has been facing over nearly 2.5 years of a direct and indirect aggression, a blatant interference in its domestic affairs and breaches of its sovereignty and independence, and endeavors to change its leadership and constitutional system by force. The ministry said the above-mentioned attempts are made by the US and its Western and regional allies, especially France, Britain, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and their tools, namely the armed terrorist groups and Al-Qaeda organizations with its formations, offshoots, wings and designations like Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. Prime Minister al-Halaqi inspected the work mechanism in Tishrin Mel Firefighter Brigade and the Syrian-Iranian company for cars manufacturing, the factory of iron for manufacturing minerals, cement factory and gas factory in Adra area in Damascus countryside. In a statement to reporters, al-Halaqi referred to the importance of Adra industrial city in organizing national, regional and foreign investments in Syria and achieving the industrial security, noting that the number of industrial institutions in the city has doubled from 420 institutions before the crisis up to 630, in addition to the increase of investment volume this year through 260 billion Syrian pounds investments. A source at the UN said that all references to sanctions or a use of force against Syria and the draft resolution on the chemical weapons was omitted during the second meeting of the UN Security Council Permanent States Representatives, according to Russia Today website. The website reporter said that the experts expected vote on the draft resolution presented by the USA, Britain and France at the weekend, which means that the Council meetings will continue until they reach a compromise formula among all sides. Syria is participating in the 15th meeting of the General Assembly of the Organization of Asia-Pacific News Agency, ONAN, which kicked off in the Russian capital, Moscow. General Director of the Syrian Arab News Agency, Sana Ahmad Dawu, and the Director of the Syrian Media Center in Moscow, Fahad Kamankash, are attending the activities of the meeting, which is held at Moscow World Trade Center and will last until September the 22nd. The National Dialogue Follow-Up Committee, which steamed from Tehran conference, held a press conference at Damaros Hotel in Damascus on the outcome of its visit to China on September the 19th to the 17th. Member of Parliament Faisal Azuz pointed out that all meetings held with the Chinese officials were successful and fruitful in terms of conveying the viewpoint of large spectrums of the Syrian people on a number of political, social and economic issues under the current circumstances. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi affirmed that his country supports a solution to the crisis in Syria through dialogue, saying that China will play a positive, constructive role in this regard. At a press conference with his U.S. counterpart, John Kerry, the Chinese Foreign Minister welcomed the Russian-U.S. agreement on the chemical weapons in Syria, expressing that there has to be an early agreement on the resolution that should be taken by the organization on banning the chemical weapons to be later approved by the UN Security Council. Army operations continued during several terrorist dens. Weapons and equipment were destroyed, including a car bomb in Homs, and many terrorists were killed and injured. Authorities seized a terrorist warehouse full of weapons and ammunition in Bayad Nader area near Daraya in Damascus countryside. 10 citizens were martyred and several others were injured in 2 terrorist attacks near Rafin Cross Point on Homs Masyaf and Al-Karada Rusnia and Al-Hisya roads. A military source said that the terrorists detonated an explosive device when a bus passed by a Homs Masyaf road, martyring 9 citizens and injuring others. Pope of the Vatican, Francis, calls on the European Union to work for reaching a political solution to the crisis in Syria through dialogue. Italian news agency, in a statement issued by the Apostolic See, quoted the Pope as saying that we need to guarantee peace in the Middle East, particularly in Syria. Russian President Vladimir Putin said major international decisions have to be made collectively and should not be monopolized. President Putin was speaking in Validi International Dialogue Forum in Moscow. He said that decisions must be made collectively, not on the basis of some countries' or groups' interests. The international law, not the law of force, must be implemented. Putin considered the Syrian government agreement to join the Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC, a practical step that inspires confidence. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif called for dismantling Israel's huge arsenal of nuclear and chemical weapons, affirming that Syria's agreement to place chemical weapons under international supervision has stripped Israel of any excuse to keep its weapons of mass destruction. Zarif is currently in New York to attend the 68th session of the UN General Assembly. And that's the end of our news bulletin for tonight. Thank you for kindly listening.
Damascus Radio presents News and Views.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Syria, a peace-loving country, has been for decades working for the restorations of the Israeli-occupied Golan. Syria's participation in Madrid peace process on the basis of the UN Security Council Resolution 242 and 338 has led to progress regarding the restoration of the Golan. Syria's work for peace has been accompanied with her repeated calls for the freeing of the Middle East region from all mass destruction weapons. As a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, Syria presented a proposal to rid the region from MDWs in 2003. Unfortunately, such a proposal was shelved by the USA, which has been lobbying and threatening Syrians of launching attacks against them, not to mention the US covert as well as covert or overt alliance with Al-Qaeda affiliates as to destroy the secular Syria. With this in mind, Syria has recently joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC, and out of its latent desire for peace, stabilized and tranquility, Syria is indeed keen on the realization of the just and comprehensive peace in the Middle East. Hopefully, others would recognize that in the global village of today, it is peace and only peace which can deter as well as secular all. Thus, the U.S. administration of Mr. Barack Obama has a chance says no now to sponsor peace instead of sword-rattling and war crimes. A U.S.-led attack on Syria without United Nations support would be a war crime, regardless of congratulation or Congressional approval, Noam Chokri, and the anti-war activist and author, said in response to President Barack Obama's announcement that he would seek HAL approval. Chomsky said, as international support for Obama's decision to attack Syria has collapsed along with the credibility of government claims, the administration has fallen back on a standard pretext for war crimes when all else fails the credibility of the threats of the self-designated policemen of the world.
That was News and Views from Damascus Radio. Damascus Radio presents Syrian Local Press Review.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Syrian newspapers published today highlight the following headlines and items of news. President al-Assad to Fox News. Syria supported Geneva process from the very beginning. The Russian role politically was very efficient during the crisis. Foreign Ministry sends letters to the UN on U.S. Western funding and arming of terrorists in Syria. Premier inspects several establishments in Adra area, Damascus countryside. Organizations of Asia-Pacific News Agency General Assembly meets in Moscow with Syria's participation. National Dialogue Follow-up Committee visit to China is successful and fruitful. China to play constructive role in solving the crisis. U.S. admits disagreements on negotiations. Car bomb, anti-tank missiles, rocket launch beds destroyed in several areas. Authorities seize a terrorist warehouse full of weapons and ammunition in Daria. Scores of terrorists killed, 15 anti-tank missiles destroyed in Damascus countryside. Several citizens martyred, other injured in terrorist attacks in Homs. Pope Francis calls for adopting political solution in Syria. Bhutan, Syria's accession to WCW inspires confidence. Iran, Syria's accession to WCW strips Israel of excuses to keep its WMD arsenal. Syrian and Yemeni teachers syndicate stage sitting outside UN headquarters in Damascus. UN references to sanctions or use of force against Syrian draft resolution on Syria omitted. Slovakia, importance of reaching political solution for crisis in Syria. In its editorial, authority newspaper said that since the beginning of the crisis in Syria, the U.S. has been exploiting its great influence to employ the UN and its affiliated bodies to serve its conspiracy against Syria. The U.S. and its allies have been driving a number of UN organizations from their noble goals and purposes, pushing them to ignore human rights violations in occupied areas, particularly in Palestine and the Syrian Golan, all while these organizations race in an unprecedented manner to take biased decision against Syria to increase the shading of the Syrian blood and the destruction of the country, thereby giving Israel a green light to increase its oppression, crimes and settlements in the occupied Arab lands. The Daily added that the recent report presented by the Commission of Inquiry on Syria was full of bias, exaggeration and disinformation, and it lacked credibility and authentic testimonies. The paper said that it seems that the Commission has neither heard nor seen the savage atrocities and heinous crimes of Al-Qaeda affiliated organization and the Takfiri groups in the area that they attacked the public executions before the children and women and the acts of vandalism against factories, hospitals and public utilities. Moreover, the Commission alleged that the Syrian government is destroying its health institutions. This is a very cheap and politicized disinformation because there is no country in the world that demolishes its hospitals and infrastructure. The paper went on to say that the report ignored the fact that the main factor behind the internal displacement of the Syrian citizens is the terrorist operations by the Takfiri groups and the forceful dislocation on sectarian grounds. It also ignored the unfair and unjustifiable sanctions targeting the Syrian citizens in their livelihood, health conditions, education and other basic human rights. The Daily concluded that was the case with the previous reports. The Commission did not maintain truth and objectively and ignored scores of ethnetics documents submitted by the Syrian government that belie the groundless allegations of the parties complicit in shading the Syrian blood.
That was a review of the Syrian local press issued in Damascus this morning. Former UN envoy to Syria, Kofi Annan, voiced hope that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. State Secretary John Kerry will reach agreement on a full political settlement for the crisis in Syria and not just on chemical weapons. In a press statement on Friday, Annan hoped that Lavrov and Kerry will not limit their discussions to the chemical weapons issue, but also look into the large number of issues related to political settlement in Syria in a manner that would reflect on the humanitarian situation in it. Annan said that the meeting between Lavrov and Kerry was a positive and constructive reality and that the initiative on chemical weapons in Syria matured very quickly, hoping that progress in this field will continue. He hoped that the discussions would lead to practical suggestions, opining that the deal on chemical weapons will facilitate holding dialogue and negotiations among the Syrian sides. Annan also stressed the need to implement the agreements which will be made regarding the Syrian chemical weapons issue. The Iraqi government categorically denied allegations by some sides in the so-called Syrian opposition to claim that chemical weapons were transported from Syria into Iraq. Ali al-Musawi, media advisor of the Iraqi Prime Minister, said in a press statement that some sides in the Syrian opposition claimed that the Syrian government transported parts of the chemical weapons in Syria to Iraq in an attempt to tarnish the image of Iraq, whose people were victims of such prohibited weapons. Al-Musawi said that as the Iraqi government categorically denies these reports and views them as cheap propaganda, it calls upon those making these allegations to work for the interests of Syria and its people instead of being mouthpieces and pawns of other countries that seek to undermine Iraq. He asserted that Iraq is against the possession of such weapons and other weapons of mass destruction anywhere in the world and under any pretexts. Earlier, biased media outlets had circulated statements of leaders of terrorist groups in Syria who claimed that chemical weapons were transported from Syria into Iraq. Worldwide manifestations of solidarity with Syria and rejection of the US and Western threats of launching an aggression are gaining momentum daily and taking various forms, including seminars, sit-ins, and rallies. Peace lovers and anti-war activists and supporters abroad are sharing the Syrians their rejection of the false allegations about chemical weapons use brought by Western sides against their government. In this very context, members of the Syrian community in France staged on Saturday a protest in Charles de Gaulle Square in Rouen city denouncing any military intervention in Syria. Waving the Syrian flags and photos of President Bashar al-Assad, the protesters chanted the slogans rejecting war on Syria. They stressed the importance of cooperation with the Syrian leadership instead of providing support to the armed terrorist groups so as to end the crisis and achieve the interest of the Syrian people. Meanwhile, in Canada, Syrian expatriates and a number of Canadian anti-war associations and clergymen organized an event in Montreal to express solidarity with the Syrian army and leadership until achieving victory.
In tonight's edition, we will be talking about New Ugarit. Ras ibn Hani, where the New Ugarit was located north of the city of Latakia. Initially, the site was chosen to build the Meridian International Hotel, but when construction works started, a bulldozer struck a solid stone wall, which proved to be a pure historical site. The work ceased and the hotel site was removed to its present location on the southern sand beach. Rapidly, the Directorate of Archaeology and Museums has tended to expropriate the site and start excavations. In 1975 year, there was a joint Syrian-French mission. It was formed, starting excavations uninterruptedly until this date. Findings prove that Ras ibn Hani had witnessed the rise of several civilizations, starting from the Ugarit period until the 6th century AD. During its history, Ras ibn Hani had several names. First, Affo. This name was frequently mentioned in Ugarit texts, meaning the nose. Secondly, Ugarit of the Sea. This name was mentioned in one of the clay boats discovered in the site. A third name was Biruti, which means city of wells, since the site was full of wells, drilled in the rocks. Till today, each year we discover a well or two. The site discoveries referred to as a New Ugarit are of utmost importance, since they complement evidence about a civilization 2,000 years ago. It was also revealed important information about Oriental history in general and Syrian one in particular through different history epochs. With this, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of our weekly program, Selected Readings. Kindly join us again next week at the same time and on the same wave. We wish you all the best from Radio Damascus. Good night.